Stanley Kubrick is rightly regarded as one of Hollywood's most legendary directors, with a career spanning more than 40 years that saw him create some of the most iconic and influential movies of all time, in genres ranging from sci-fi to horror, war, satirical comedy and dystopian thriller. 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, Doctor Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket were all made by this one dude, and honestly, I could probably spend hours talking about the impact that Kubrick had on 20th century cinema. But today I'm winding the clock back to 1957 for one of his earlier movies, Paths of Glory, a movie about 3 World War I soldiers standing trial for cowardice in the wake of a failed attack that ultimately went on to become one of the most powerful anti-war films ever made. The story is told mostly from the point of view of Colonel Dax, played by Kirk Douglas, the commander of a French infantry regiment on the Western Front in 1916. The war's been raging for 2 years now and the front line is in a stalemate. The French High Command are determined to break the deadlock, so they order Dax's regiment to make an attack against a fortified German position known as the Anthill. Dax tries to warn them that launching an offensive against a strong enemy position with a single depleted regiment makes about as much sense as trying to stop a tank with a BB gun, but they're like, nah, it'll be fine.
General, you're saying that more than half my men will be killed.
Yes, it's a terrible price to pay, Colonel. But we will have the anthill.
Needless to say, the attack turns out to be a complete disaster. The first wave is pinned down in no man's land and cut to pieces, and the second wave refuses to even leave their trenches. Can't say I blame them, to be honest. Dax's commander isn't too impressed though, mostly because he has a promotion resting on this. He expects them to carry on the suicidal attack no matter the casualties, and even orders his artillery to start shelling his own men as punishment. What a dick. In the aftermath of the attack, he's baying for blood. He wants to set an example and demands that 100 men from Dax's regiment be executed for cowardice. Eventually though, they're able to talk him down to just 3 men selected at random to stand trial for cowardice in the face of the enemy. If they're found guilty, they'll be executed by firing squads. The men are selected through a mixture of personal grudges, discrimination, and sheer fucking bad luck. And since Dax was a lawyer before the war, he volunteers to lead the defense. It soon becomes pretty obvious though that the trial is a complete sham. There's not even a pretense of justice or finding out the truth, and the outcome was decided before it even began. And well, I think you can guess where it all leads. The decision to make a strongly anti-war movie based on the experience of World War I was a pretty unusual one given the climate of the time. Back in the 1950s, war movies were usually big, bombastic, patriotic affairs about American heroism and bravery triumphing against unambiguously evil enemies. The kind of simple, feel-good stuff that everyone could enjoy before heading home for meatloaf and apple pie. Or whatever Americans ate in the 1950s, I don't fucking know. Anyway, the idea of telling a somber, reflective and relentlessly bleak story about the previous generation's war must have seemed like commercial insanity, and in some ways, it kinda was. Paths of Glory was made on a budget of $900,000, and by all accounts, it barely managed to break even. Reviews at the time were mixed, and it's another example of a film that only really got the recognition it deserved in later decades. By the 1970s, there was a strong anti-war sentiment, for obvious reasons, and that's when Paths of Glory really began to take off. Nowadays though, it's seen as one of the greatest war movies of all time, with overwhelmingly positive reviews across the board, and rightly so, because Paths of Glory is fucking incredible. Stanley Kubrick was a master of exploring the dehumanizing effects of war, whether it's the unbridled insanity of Doctor Strangelove, or the individual young men getting broken down and remade into mindless killing machines from Full Metal Jacket. But I think he does his best work right here in Paths of Glory, focusing as it does on the first truly industrialized war, with human courage and compassion rendered helpless in the face of uncaring mechanized slaughter. The doomed attack across no man's land with long tracking shots and shaky camera work is an absolute masterclass of cinematography, perfectly capturing the chaos and confusion and horror of waves of men throwing themselves uselessly against machine guns and artillery. Honestly, if this movie had been shot in colour, you could have sworn it was made in the last 20 years. It's aged that damn well. Compare this with the big wide-angle static shots of the generals having breakfast at a luxurious French chateau miles from the front line as they decide the fates of thousands of men. 2 wildly contrasting worlds presented in very different ways. I've got to give huge props to the actors too. Kirk Douglas was solid as a rock throughout his career, and he delivers a brilliantly restrained performance as Colonel Dax here. A good man trying to do his duty in an impossible situation, brimming with anger and resentment at the injustice being done.
My only aim is to remind you of the heroism these men have shown on every occasion in the past.
We're not talking about the past. We're talking about the present.
But don't you see, sir, they're not cowards, so if some of them didn't leave the trenches, it must have been because it was impossible.
Remember when male protagonists acted like actual men and conducted themselves with a little bit of dignity, restraint, and self-control? I like that. But damn, I've really got to tip my hat to George McCreary as General Moreau, a slimy, arrogant opportunist who would happily sacrifice innocent lives in a futile attack just to advance his career.
The life of one of those soldiers means more to me than all the stars and decorations and honors in France.
So, you think this attack is absolutely beyond the ability of your men at this time?
I didn't say that, George.
Who's willing to launch artillery strikes against his own troops to force them to advance, and reacts with bluster and indignation when he's called out for his bullshit.
So that's it. You're making me the goat. The only completely innocent man in this whole affair.
And what's amazing about the script and the performance is that you know, even by the end of the movie, that he still doesn't understand what he did wrong. He's the perfect distillation of every pampered, out-of-touch commander who sent his men into a meat grinder knowing he'd never be held accountable for what happens. Not many people could accuse Paths of Glory of being an uplifting movie, especially the poignant ending that sees a captured German girl singing for the surviving soldiers as they slowly break down in tears, knowing that they'll soon be heading back to the battlefield themselves. But I guess that's exactly the point. It's not meant to make you feel good, it's meant to make you take a step back from your own life, to reflect on the sacrifices, mistakes, triumphs and disasters of previous generations, and perhaps to be thankful that you don't have to endure what they did. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.